Welcome to today's session of Boardroom Bites at 9. Our topic is governance in SMEs and family-run businesses. Our speaker for this morning is Tony Balshaw, and I'm sure Tony is not a stranger for many of you that are on this morning. Tony's been part of the IoDSA family for a long time and part of our governance structures as well. Tony is a leading expert in family-run businesses and the application of governance within the family-run businesses as well. So Tony, I'm going to hand over to you, but before I do, I have a poll that I would like to run just so that Tony has an idea of who's in the room with us today. So I'm going to be launching that poll now. You should see that on your screen. So we just would like to know, who's joining us this morning. Are you a family member in a family-run business? Are you a non-executive in a family-run business? Are you intermediate, consultant, academic, or other? You can pick more than one choice, depending on where you fit in. So I'll give you a few seconds to fill that in, please. And while you do that, Tony's going to be giving, we do have a longer session this morning, as you would have seen in the invite. Our session is running till around 10:30 this morning because Tony has got a lot to share, and he's going to be giving a nice high-level overview around governance in family-run businesses, and also we'll be touching on some of the things that are keeping family-run businesses up at night during this time. When we get to the Q&A session, I will come back on again, and I'm going to help Tony to facilitate some of the questions. If you would like to ask a question live, you are welcome to raise your hand and I'll assist you with that. So I'm going to end the poll because I see most people have already answered. I'm going to share the results so that everybody can have a look. We've got about a 50-50, I guess, 30% in each are currently family members in a family-run business and are either intermediaries or consultants. And then we've got the majority are other. So Tony, I hope that gives you a nice overview of who's in the room today. I know not everyone has joined yet, so those stats may change a little bit, but it gives you a good view. So Tony, I'm going to be off. You'll have to take control of my screen again, Tony. Sorry, because I had to put the poll on. So I'll see everyone again during the Q&A.
Oh dear. Now what's happened is the picture's gone. But morning, everybody. I'm sure we'll get that sorted out. But it really is extraordinary times that we're living in, and we've had the COVID pandemic around about us. Many of us are at home, able to have a cup of coffee next to us in this chilly weather. So if you just bear with us while we just get the picture up and going, because it's got me as a post-attendee now. So what we've had is we've had the COVID pandemic, and it's created a lot of issues for particularly family-owned and closely held businesses. These family businesses, some that I've worked with and some that I know have been going since 1899. They're no longer around. They blame the pandemic, but a lot of it had to do with succession and continuity planning. Sorry, I'm just going to see if we can get back on again because I don't have the slides and it appears to have taken me off. So Vicky, if you could maybe just assist. I'm probably going to have to go in again.
Okay, I can move have your slides disappeared from your screen, Tony?
Yeah, but just give me a moment. I'm hoping that I'll be able to open it up now. Yeah, I haven't got any slides on my screen. Are you able to see me?
Yes, so we can see you.
Super. And so let's carry on then. And I have picked up again on my screen. So it's very difficult business conditions prior to the pandemic that businesses found them in, particularly family businesses. We've had the social justice movement just last night, attack on a potato farming family in the Free State. We've got climate change. There's all of this coming at us, and yet half of all companies of family business, more than 80% of businesses are family businesses, supplying half the world's workforce and creating half of the GDP. But yet people don't understand what are the issues and what are the dynamics. And key to this is governance. Governance, not just from a business point of view, but governance as well from a family point of view, and how do these interact and interrelate. So I've had the privilege of working across the globe with family businesses over the last 25 years. I'm a speaker resource for the YPO with families right across the world, including Pakistan, Egypt. They had just launched their stock exchange there, working with those families. So you have to deal with how do we govern the family, and how do we govern the business, and how do we deal with these development phases, the biological clock that is ticking, and these changes that closely held family businesses and SMEs face. About 9 years ago, there was a tragic air crash off Plettenberg Bay, where the CEO, a young family member who was the CEO, had taken over from Dad, died in the crash. And I had the media all over me saying, what is it going to do to the share price? And there was speculation, and the share took a hit. And I said, well, this is a JSE listed entity. They've got sound governance structures and mechanisms in place. And I hadn't worked directly with the family, but one knows in terms of those structures that are in place that they were able to continue. And whilst it's very tragic for the family, from a succession continuity point of view, and that and the structures were in place to be able to cope with difficulties. You've got others that are closely held and family businesses that are family owned and controlled, but professionally managed. That's a transition that many successful family businesses go through, which is different to once you've gone for the IPO and you're listed. And then you've got the very strong owner-managed business, and if that person hasn't let go by the age of 70, you face a potential crisis because they're going to struggle to let go. And those that have got it right have been very, very successful. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you some of the lenses to have a look at these issues that family businesses, SMEs, typically face. So let's have a look here if I've got control, and if there we go. And so we're at the next slide. We've got the emotion-based family system. So the sharing, caring, nurturing, most of us come from families, and we know what it's all about. Protecting the low achievers. We're risk averse, we don't like change, or let's get the money out of the business and into the family's hands so that we can preserve the wealth. The business is a task-based, outward orientation, unemotional, generally, rewards performance. Either you perform or you need to exit the business, reinvest the capital to grow the business. And so what you find typically, these are in conflict with each other. A family system that is emotion-based, a task-based business system, the family find themselves in the overlap of those systems. And that's why communication, decision, governance structures are so critically important. But they need to work for the family, understanding these dynamics. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you a slide. And if you've gone off to get some coffee, do come back for this. We've got a family system where there's clearly, and what I want to show you here is on the left-hand side, you've got the family. We're born into a family, they've got a family around us, it can be a blended family, whatever it is, we could sit in circle one. Or if we're an employee in a business, but you're not a family member, we don't we sit in circle three. If we own shares, let's say we own shares in a company, but we're not involved in the business and we're not family, well, that's very different. So there's no emotional attachment. Now what happens is you find in a family business that you might have a family member that chooses to bring their career into the family business. And so that would be number 6 in terms of the overlap of those two systems. If I'm a non-family executive and maybe I own some shares, and often, I suppose you can say often, a number of occasions you find that the key executives that have come into the business in the right-hand man and they own a minority interest in the business. Then you've got a family that owns shares, whether it's through a trust or equity, and it may be in terms of a very large family listed company, or it might be the smaller businesses, and they would sit in the overlap of those two, but they might not be involved in the system. And typically the founder and those family members that have chosen to bring their life into the business would sit at number 7. But how do we measure a family member? If they may be committed owners and they bring a great perspective from an ownership circle. So how do we interact as those people with those that are maybe in the business? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at governance from really 2 pillars. The one is in terms of corporate governance as we know it. That's in the King report. And for those of you that are familiar with King 4, you'll know in terms of the supplement that deal with privately held and closely held entities as a separate supplement. And they refer a lot to the book that I wrote on the topic called Thrive, Making Family Business Work. And then I wrote a book some years ago for the Institute of Directors on governance in family business. And so what I'm going to share with you are the insights I've gained working with family businesses across the globe, from North America, Africa, South Africa. South Africa is a wonderful country because we've got so many different cultures and origins in terms of families here. And I've probably worked with each and every one on a number of occasions of that. And it's a tremendous privilege. And you have a look at their values and what is important. But the issues family businesses face are very similar, but you've got to find your own unique solution to those issues. So what I'm going to present as governance structures, yes, it's good stuff in terms of King 4 and principles based, but how do we go about applying those principles? I'm going to try and give you some insights into that today. So that's what we call typically the 3-circle model, and it really is good when you're looking at issues to say, is this a family issue we're dealing with? Is this a business issue, or is this an ownership issue? And then we need to have the four. I'm going to show you later on in the presentation exactly what structures are unique to family businesses that have worked across the world. Okay, so sorry, we just skipped over this slide. When we look at this, and this is also very key to one's thinking, if you look on the vertical axis there, we've got influence. The influence that the founder may have over the business is significant, as you can see. We call it the incumbent at the top. And then you've got over a period of time. So for meaningful succession to happen, it's not an overnight event. The problem is it's often triggered by what I call the coronary. And then families are in all this turmoil, have to deal with the decisions and issues that were much easier for the incumbent in terms of sweeping them under the carpet. But it can be a spark that ignites the inferno, or it can be the trigger in terms of, what I talk about as the coronary. But really, it's a process. One cannot ignore these issues. The biological clock ticks, the development phases happen. So over time, we need to look at issues like succession and continuity. We need to look at governance structures. We need to look at bringing non-family members into the business. Now, how do we do that? So what's shown on this diagram is there's a process of letting go over a period of time, and there's no fixed time on this. Yes, at the age of 32, people evaluate their career and life choices, as I've said before. At the age of late 50s, you become very good mentors. At the age of 70, if you haven't let go, you're facing some serious challenges and issues. And unfortunately, we don't have the time to go into all of that today. And I did run a seminar for the firm that I'm with, SNG Grant Thornton, and we are going to run a series dealing with those other issues. But what you find is that you need to hand over to, and don't just assume that it's going to be the same business model that worked when you had a very strong personality that was running the business. Often all that experience, knowledge, expertise needs to be devolved into structures. And so what one finds is one ends up with management meetings. You sit with structures that I'm going to show you just now in terms of executive committees and that. For the business, you need to have structures for the family, structures where the family can talk, where the family can develop and talk about a shared dream. Because if there isn't a shared dream from an ownership point of view, then one needs to have conversations about, do we go instead of from the typical owner-managed business into a sibling partnership, into the cousins, consortium, and the constellation of family after that. We need to say, well, do we revert effectively that a family member or branch buys out the business from the family, or do we have a sale of the business, but in a controlled let-down fashion? So we need to have a look and have these conversations about succession and the continuity. And it's not just in terms of ownership, and it's not just in terms of management. You've got to look at those aspects separately. So that gives you some idea of the evolutionary change from one or two key individuals to where the control needs to be vested and the governance in structures itself. And so today, we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about values and shared dreams, but those are absolutely critical, and to have those conversations. Right, then what are the concerns that business owners have that keeps themselves up at night? And I've just listed a number of them here. trying to make decisions with my head instead of my heart. So a family system is emotional. There's the sense of saying, I built this company up to where I'd love to hand it on as a legacy to the next generation. Well, is it practical? Is it feasible? Do the next generation want to continue to own and manage the business? If they do, well, then they've got to work on communication and structures and governance going forward, governance of the family and governance of the business. How do we meet our current obligations in this economy, in this world that's on its head? How do we continue after the pandemic? And the pandemic has brought a lot of these issues to the fore. And I have had a number of Teams meetings and currently working with a number of families here in South Africa, in the UK and elsewhere. So there's also a sense of control that John Wayne, the person's on top of everything, losing that control in terms and the culture under professional management. How do we cope with that and deal with that? You know, they'll all say, if you're a Coca-Cola bottler, well, it's in our veins. Families just talk about that product, that passion that they have for it. They've grown up in it. They, as kids, when it was difficult times for the parents getting the business going, they made sacrifices as well. And how do you reward family members that are in the business, taking the business forward, but you've got other family members that are owners, but they're not involved in the business, and we'll touch on that briefly. Increasing cost of complexity as the work scope expands, and this is where the IoD is fantastic in terms of having these courses that they run in terms of an introduction to governance and giving the family members the lenses, because as many of you know, they are onerous obligations when you become a director of a company. So just now we'll talk about advisory boards and others and how that evolutionary change happens. Right, the strategic direction that satisfies the elder generation's dividend needs, in other words, getting money out of the company, with the company that needs to be able to grow and money continue to be reinvested in the business. So in that first generation phase, you hock the house, the budget, the cat, the dog, everything to the bank, that's fine. But now what happens is if all the sureties have been provided by the senior generation, if they've got no wealth out of the business, they're never going to let go. They're going to struggle to let go. So how do we deal with that issue? Right, unwillingness to listen or learn and open to new ideas. This is the way we've done it. This is the way we always do it. And clearly things change and people need to let go. What about minority investors? It's all good and well treating the family business as a family piggy bank. But when you've got outsiders that own it, you've got to professionalize the way that you govern and the way that you treat the business. But possible need for job reductions, negative impact that it has, cost to manufacture, having a qualified workforce. How do I get money out of the business with this paper rich, cash poor? Those are all concerns that these guys have. Repurposing our company for future needs. The markets have changed. It's online now. How have we adapted? We've seen how people that were in the restaurant business suddenly selling their product or pizzas on the pavement, doing it a lot quicker than they anticipated that they would go. And they see the next generation coming in, and they call these Gen Zs, you know, digital natives. In other words, they know no other world, and they just have warmed to this, and it's created incredible impetus for many businesses that are trying to survive in these difficult times. And again, it depends what sector one is in. A soft board of directors is very problematic. You know, to get a whole lot of yes people on that are maybe friends of the senior generation is hugely problematic, and one sees that. I'm going to be talking about that just now. The senior executive team, those in the business are getting old. And then there's lack of agreement from the next generation that one's hoping will take over as to the direction the founder wants to take the business and or where they're wanting to take the business. This is starting to, I'm sure, resonate with many of you. And yet there's so many successful family businesses, and what have they done? We'll talk about that. All right, so from the point of view of governance, one needs to have a look and say, well, we've got to professionalize this business. We have to hold management accountable. So how do we govern? We need more formalized and reporting. You know, what you find with these entrepreneurs, it's innate, it's the gut feel. And we've got tremendous women entrepreneurs that have been in this country and are in this country. We've got men that, but how do we now take that gut instinct that they've had that's driven them to where they are in terms of formalizing the planning and the reporting? And yes, family businesses have got long-term orientation, but as the family members that are maybe not involved to the in the business, there's asymmetries of information. Some of them don't have lack of information, yet the pillow talk of a family member in the business has got a lot more information that is flowing. So how do you set up those structures? And it's been fascinating going on retreats with family, seeing the next generation that were maybe 12 years of age, realizing that that family retreat was very meaningful to the family. You talk to them now as adults in their 30s, and they say, gee, you know, where we were and where we are, and we saw how important that was for the senior generation. Best practices should be followed. So it is there. One can talk about it. As I said, I wrote a book for the IoD on governance in family business. And the practices that are in and around King, whether it's 2, 3, 4, and there's great stuff, that the People, Profit, Planet, all of this type of stuff is there. Family members need to embrace it. But again, you know, many of you would, and I saw on the poll, that come from an academic background, or you were schooled at university in terms of governance and all that, or you've done your traineeship as a chartered accountant, and you say, well, there is no other way. But understand that you've got an emotion-based family system that comes into play. So I work with family businesses where people are doing their masters in family business and say, Tony, can you assist us? And they say at the end, well, you know, actually I did this on this topic because of my family, and can you come and assist in working with the senior generation and moving forward? Okay, and there also needs to be goal alignment and effort to achieve the objectives, but those need to be shared objectives, having a shared dream and all the company. All right, as you know, in terms of governance, they talk about the stakeholder inclusive approach. That's very important. The interdependence amongst the stakeholders. So we've got family, we've got business that we've identified, we've got people that are in the business, we've got regulators, we have staff, we have representative organizations that all have legitimate interests and expectations, these stakeholders. And so I'm really going to be focusing on the legitimate interests and expectations of family members who have got a stake in the business itself and in the company. And it's not there simply to serve their self-interest, because as I said in the beginning, if you want to take money out of the business, you just do it when you own a managed business. But now if you've got other stakeholders that are in the business, how do you deal with that aspect? It's not just the family piggy bank any longer. So what are we missing? And I'll just read this. The substance of good corporate governance is more important than its form. So we're talking principles here today. Adoption of a set of rules and principles, any other particular practice or policy, is not a substitute and does not itself assure good corporate governance. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk about the family business structures, and that within the context of some of the principles in King 4. And it's wonderful to see people like Richard Forster writing articles on the impact that COVID is having on businesses from a King 4 perspective. So these are principles. They're not rules, they're not regulations, they're principle-based. And how best to take a family SME closely held business and apply the King principles to it. Okay, so let's just have a look at trust. And clearly, trust is the glue that binds family together. Trust in terms of, are the people competent? Are the people doing what they say they will do? And so we need to, within that particular circle, so whether it be a family circle or whatever, and in and between the board and management and the owners. And that's critical from a corporate governance perspective in family businesses. All right, so principle 7, I'm just picking up some of these, talk about a board should have an appropriate balance of knowledge, skills, experience, diversity, independence in order to discharge its roles and responsibilities objectively and effectively. So what is necessary? And when I work with families, a lot of what I'm doing is giving them the lenses to look at the issues, and not everybody schooled in governance and governance structures and their roles and functions. And so it's very important to get balance when you're looking at the board, a board that has the right skill set, that has the knowledge, experience. We'll talk about the need in terms of demographics, gender, all those benefits that are brought to a board. And some of you will have seen, and there's been some great movies like The Post and that, where you see family members that are maybe chairpersons of a board of directors having some really onerous decisions to make. So it's very important in terms of achieving this balance, and to bring a senior generation family member that's over 70, their cronies onto the board isn't the way to go. And we'll see the benefits in terms of the stability and the continuity and the longevity and all of these good things that they bring, but we need to get the balance right. All right, so in corporate governance, and if you look at King 4, it talks about the governing body's primary role and responsibility. So it steers, gives strategic direction in terms of the company, and it provides the leadership, approves the policy and the planning that happens that feeds up to the board. And then within that, we have subcommittees that oversee and monitor, ensures the accountability. So audit committees, remuneration committees. Now that can be fairly foreign when I'm dealing with a family business that is maybe in the process of professionalizing. We've got regulatory compliance, we've got risk committees. So how does that fit in? And typically, if you picture, the founder would have their trusted advisor, their accountant, or tax advisor, whatever that would be providing the advice, and they would just move on. But once you start maturing in terms of the business and transitioning, you need to have the governance structures that will play these roles. Now, the governance outcomes and ethical culture, and I'm going to talk about that and show you a very short video. How do we go about creating value and the performance of the company? And one's got to have a lot of wisdom. There's a lot of insight required in terms of where we are with the pandemic and the change that is happening, and how we go about ensuring that there is value creation and performance. And then the next point in terms of the outcome of effective control, being adequate and effective control over the business. And so we can go into a lot more detail, but we will see that there's delegations of authority that will happen from the family owners into the board, and equally from the board in terms of the executive committee, etc., and the roles and functions that they play. All right, and then in terms of legitimacy, having a good reputation. So for example, in terms of, if we ignore under COVID, the PPE and all those other requirements, that wouldn't have been good. And so some people don't necessarily recognize that that is in terms of a governance outcome that they actually fulfill. All right, so the principles, and we're going to be talking about some of the principles, understanding it's not a tick box. And we've seen so many instances where the boards simply tick boxes and they seem to have everything from charters to this and that, but they just don't live it. So it's very important that we look at what are the principles, and these embody the aspirations of the journey towards good corporate governance. So if we look at principle 1, talks about the board should lead ethically and effectively. Now I'm going to be showing a video, and it isn't very clear. So please don't reset things or complain about the digital quality that was coming through, but look at the principle. And there's really, if you hear the principle, then it's very easy to go ahead in terms of saying, well, how do we lead ethically, ethical family, ethical business, ethical governance structures that are there. So I'm going to be playing this video for you now.
A couple of days ago, I was stopped by a traffic cop for speeding. He asked me for a donation, and I agreed to give him one. Driving away, my daughter asked me, "Why did you give that man money, Dad?" And I said, because I'd done something wrong and I wanted the problem to go away. The impact of it only hit me a day or two later, when I'd given her a scolding for telling a lie, and she walked into my study and offered me 10 rand of her pocket money, saying, "Is this enough to make the problem go away, Dad?" I didn't know what to say.
That
First National Bank, we believe in the value of values, not just the value of money. Because a nation that has no values is a nation that has no wealth.
Wow, that is really, really powerful. And that's when we talk about principles. There was a great book written, and the title of the book was by a leadership guru, John Maxwell. And, you know, having read some of his other books, I suddenly saw this title said, you know, there is no such thing as business ethics. And what he was saying, and the point he was making, is there's only ethics. You can't expect to have one set of values at home and another in your business. Ethics and values are the way you live them out, and having that culture that exists within the family and ensuring that it exists in the business is so critical. And it's not, and yes, we know we've got to go through ethical compliance, there's independence requirements, particularly in a profession like mine. But at the end of the day, it's about the principle and how we go and live it. And there's no such thing as business ethics, there's only ethics. We have to walk our talk. And that's a principle. And so what I'm trying to do, and why I use this as an illustration, is to give you an idea of how those principles apply. So when I work with family business, I kick off by asking them, what are your goals, your ambitions, your life plan, but also what are your values? What do you value? Your culture is the way you express those values. And it's amazing when you sit down, we share very similar values, and how do we actually give effect to those values? So that's an idea of a principle that comes into play. We've spoken about 7. So when we look at these characteristics of good governance, so now we want to go and we want to find people that can come on board. With me professionally, I've declined many times to come on as a director, but I've agreed to come on as an advisor to advise these boards and these directors. Because one needs to understand, to be a director has got onerous obligations. It's not just the next generation come in and we make them directors of the company and it's all going to be hunky-dory. Right, so integrity, caliber and credibility of those individuals, the skill set that they have and the experience that they have that they can bring to the table. Judgment, independent of management. In other words, they're not just lackeys. They can say, but why? You know, I think it's Mervyn King that talks about an intellectual naivety, asking the dumb question, but why? The 2-year-old, you know, from you know, seeing kids around, these kids say, but why? And it's the same in terms of the board. We need to ask the dumb question. I mustn't feel that it's a dumb question because it's an intellectual. And tell me why. When we're sitting in the board and we're holding people accountable for discussing issues. Courage to express opinions. In my view, it's this, you know, we're not just lackeys. We've got to have rigorous debate and discussion, asking the difficult questions. We've got to be decisive. You might have 40 to 70% of the facts I read the other day, and people make decisions on that. And sometimes you've got to go, and is there risk? Yes, there is risk. But is it mitigated? Have you managed that risk? Strong interpersonal and communication skills. Very important to be able to if you're a CEO in a family or closely held business, you've got to traverse the politics of the family when you're dealing with it, with the family and the family dynamics that I play. And look at what works well with others and learn from others. And then when you've got conflict is normal. It's the way that you handle it that's so important. Even within families, nobody likes conflict, but conflict is normal. And we've got to just see the way that we actually manage it and handle that conflict. Right, so again, Vicky has given me extra time. Thank you, Vicky, but there's a lot to cover and I'm wanting to really get to some of the other issues. But being able to think strategically. The problem is some people can only see here, but what actually lies over the horizon? Well, how does 2021 look? How are we going to take ourselves forward after this COVID lockdown? What does the world look like? Change is so speeded up, by the time we realize what's happening, the world has moved on. So we've got to be very, very dynamic. In the past, what might have worked is not necessarily going to work for the future. We've got to have bold leadership, people that stand up there that are actually able to lead. And it can be a collective leadership rather than just in the founder. And then there's the devolution from that founder into the structures. You need to be inquisitive, inquiring, asking the questions, analytical, be able to analyze. And I always say to family members, go on a basic finance course, understand what an income statement is and what a balance sheet or statement of financial position and all these new terms, for some people that they've got to get used to. What is cash flow all about? They say turnover is vanity, profit is sanity, but cash is reality. Do people understand that? You can't expect everybody to be the CFO and have that understanding, but they've got to have a level of understanding if they're going to play a meaningful role going into the future. Incisive, getting to the core of the issue. What really underpins this? What's at the nub of it? We've spoken about business and finance, industry awareness, very, very different. And we've seen it. How some industries have been absolutely decimated. Go and look, there's a great video by the Marriott CEO, Sorensen, Arno Sorensen, that as he just talks as the non-family executive in a family-controlled business to the employees. Even Nando's in South Africa, Robbie put out a great video at the start of lockdown. And then people need to have the time and the energy. It does take energy. It's not just a matter of rocking up at meetings. If you're on a board, for example, do you get the packs? Do you have the time? And I've seen so many, and I've been in so many meetings where people come unprepared and they just don't have the energy. And you wonder at times why they even took up that role other than for financial reasons. All right, so principle 8, in terms of King 4, the board should ensure that its arrangements for delegation within its structures promote independent judgment, assist with the balance of power and effective discharge of its duties. So what is the role, and we're going to talk about that very shortly, of the Family Shareholders Committee? What is the power of the trustees from an ownership perspective? All right, principle 16, and this is where I'm going to focus on these structures now. In the execution of its governance role and responsibility, the board should adopt a stakeholder inclusive approach. So stakeholder inclusive. So remember, we've got stakeholders and between the stakeholders themselves. So with the family, they are interdependent, but we need to balance their needs and the interests and the expectation of all material stakeholders are in the best interest of the company over a period of time. So stakeholder is very important in terms of, as I said, it's the family, but equally you have regulators, you have employees, you have suppliers, et cetera, et cetera. So one needs to open one's paradigm in terms of the understanding. So here we started to get to the nub of it. If you have a look at that orange line, below it you have management team. So you might have your execo, your executive team, your CFO, your CIO, your chief marketing, head of risk, etc., sitting on this executive team. And then you've got your functional and operational teams, and those teams on the functional operational, they might have the weekly mothers meetings, as we call them, the management meetings. And then the executive team may be meeting once a month. And then you've got the governance structures, and you've got the contractual agency business corporate governance that exists. And then you've got this family, social, relational, and other obligations that exist from a family governance point of view. Now I'm going to show you where these pillars come in. So what we've got, a typical structure that you would see in terms of moving from an SME into more of a medium-sized company. You might have those management structures reporting to a board of directors. And again, there might be a holding company. So you've got the operating company and then some companies that own properties, etc., as the wealth expands. And so the businesses expand. And then ultimately reporting up to the trustees. One says, right, that's how we understand governance, but there's a whole dimension that is missing. And the other pillar, I want to introduce you to that now. In terms of the constructive reality of committed, cohesive experience, wise ownership is a resource unimaginable to businesses. And I see it in our work, and these structures that I'm talking about are I have seen working, and I've put them in place, and it really is best practice. They differ, but what we have here is really the nub of what I'm talking about. So what we have on the left-hand side is now the family, and how do we govern the family? So there's different aspects to it. I haven't shown you I've shown you the three circles: family, business, ownership, but where do you as an individual sit? So over here, I'm not too sure if you can see my cursor, are the individual family business branches, family branches. And we need to have, and sometimes we have representation. So you might have a trust where it's just a single trust owns all the effective equity of that the family own. Or we can have a number of trusts that are broken up by branches, as the Ford family did. Understand, there are many large, very large family-controlled companies in the world today. And these family businesses might only own 8 or 9% of the equity, but in terms of voting rights, they've still got significant control. So let's have a look. I'm talking about a family share owners committee, and I'm going to go through the role and function of each one of those. And so what happens is this is where usually a representative of the family branches or bloodlines sit, and they represent those individual branches of the family, sit and talk and meet as owners. What do the owners want to achieve, and what are their rightful roles and functions? And I'm going to list those just now. And they then interact with the trustees and interact with the board of directors on ownership issues. And you can see the arrows go across to the operating company, holding company, and trust. People need to realize that there's a distinction between an owner and a manager involved in the business. In fact, some families struggle with this. I had a family where 2 siblings, large business, the one sibling had passed away. The other sibling said, Tony, can you come in and can we have a combined session with the next generation? Because I'm going to have to deal with these guys from the other branch of the family, but equally with my branch. Came in, we had the meeting, we adjourned at lunchtime and had used the boardroom of the company. These family members felt empowered because the dad was no longer around and the shares were effectively theirs. And they walked into the production line and were money, but to the staff were boxes lying around. It didn't look neat and tidy. Now they were totally out of line. So people need to understand where the boundaries are in terms of these various roles and functions. And the Family Shareholders Committee is probably the most dynamic and the most powerful structure from a family point of view, and most important in terms of interacting with the other structures on the right-hand side. To the left, we have something called the Family Council, or now I call it the Family Table. How do we deal with the next generation, the youngsters that are coming through? What happens when spouses come into, or partners come into the family, so their family? How do we talk about and how do we develop our values? And so what happens is a non-legal document, and that's why I call it a creed, called a family creed, in which you articulate those values. And I'm going to give you some insight into that just now. So that's essentially what you're talking about. One thing that we have above this with a number of families is you have above this an advisory board. And so I understand we've got the unitary board structure in South Africa, and it works and it's fine when we sit in dealing with companies. And, I'm talking about, I equally deal with listed family businesses as well as the smaller ones that are professionally managed but family owned, and they've got substantial assets and wealth. But an advisory board is very useful above this here. And they have the 2-tier structure in Europe. So where I've got family businesses in Europe, they may well have that structure above. But what happens is it's good to get people to come in to advise both the Family Shareholders Committee and in terms of the company itself governance. So advisory boards, and they may well be notional. In other words, they exist in title, but they play a significant role in terms of influencing over here. So they haven't got a strict legal definition. And the advantage of that is people who really understand the onerous obligations might not want to be here, but they're happy to come into an advisory role and function. So let's talk about the Family Shareholders Committee. The danger is to get to a meeting like this, and from a humorous point of view, there is nothing in the Constitution that a member of the board can't tell the chairman to wear a pullover. So you do find these family dynamics coming through. I just love this guy in the center with his cigarette. Right. So now let's talk about the Family Shareholders Committee. So it manages the interaction between, as we saw in that diagram, the family owners and the family business. It forges the goals. You remember I said we need to have a shared dream. So we need to be able to talk as family around the table. What are our goals, our ambition? Where do we want to go? What is the vision that we have for this company? Because if I want to grow the company, well, then maybe we're going to have to reinvest the wealth that is created. Or is there an expectation that there's a certain base dividend that is paid out? How do we go about paying those base dividends or extraordinary, special dividends? And there's some family businesses, and I mean, this is public knowledge, so I can mention it, like the Gordon family from Scotland, the whiskey guys. They paid an extraordinary, not an ordinary, extraordinary dividend of 250 million pounds a couple of years ago. That's not bad paying out to the family, but don't have the expectation that that's going to be paid out every year. Or family members have loan accounts and they say, oh, when STC went out and dividends tax came in, there were some structures that went on there. So people have got large loan accounts to say, when's the family business going to pay out those loan accounts? Again, paper rich, cash poor. There isn't the cash to simply pay that out straight away. All right, looking at acquisitions and disposals, if we're going to put the family money at risk making acquisitions, well, it's fine, the board and the executives, but to what extent do we want to invest in that? In terms of disposals, if we want to dispose of the entire family business, do we have the conversations around it? Can't just be left to one family member to make those decisions. Setting goals in terms of the growth that we want to achieve, the risk that we're prepared to take, and risk is there, but we can mitigate that risk. The liquidity that we want. So many family businesses say they set a debt to equity ratio. Because as I said, when they started out the business, the founders said, well, let's just take on 100% debt plus. And as time goes on, they say, hang on, these sureties that we provided, we need to withdraw from those. We need to have a certain level, and some say we are so sick and tired of dealing with banks and being beholden to them, we're going to have no debt. So they say age is the anchor, youth is the sail. The next generation comes and say, geez, imagine if we geared this business, how we could take it to another level. And the senior amount, all my wealth involved in the business. So we've got to have these conversations. What if the business isn't profitable? So those family members in the business are taking remuneration out of the business. I'll talk to remuneration just now, but is it really being profitable? And can we afford? And should we be paying those levels of salaries? Are there top executives in the business? These are the executives, competent, and are they doing a good job? And how do we evaluate a family member? And this is where your NEDs, non-executive directors, and advisory people come into play that can assist with that. Elect directors. At the end of the day, the shareholders do the election of the directors, but just remember the basic principle is that the directors are accountable to the company and not just direct, and by implication the stakeholders, but not only to the shareholders. Evaluating the return on investment that is expected. If we're making no return on investment, well, why do we stay invested in the business? Maybe we can do other things. So we need to be evaluating that all along. And the changes in the shareholder value, is there growth in the value of the shareholder, or are we just running this company into the ground? The tragedy is one sees with SMEs is that it comes to the end of the life of the founder and there's nothing left but loan accounts. In the sense, on the other side of the balance sheet, there are no assets. So that loan account value is not going to be materialized. All right, so developing the dividend policy and considering dividend issues, the base dividends, the extraordinary dividends, what ratios are we comfortable with? And again, that's over a period of time. Determine the entry policy of family members into the family business. And the successful family creeds that I have developed, family says, well, yes, that family member has the right to apply. There's a job advertised for that, but let's tell the other family members about it so that there's not seen to be favoritism or anything, that it's gone through and it's communicated. Develop family's own share capital markets. What we're going to do, are we going to start diluting? Are we going to go from 100% under control to maybe where we've got effective control? What about if we bring private equity into the business? They're going to require a board and a seat on that, but they bring the capital in that we can grow into new markets. So I saw that in the agricultural sector with Woolworths and suppliers into them needing significant increases in the capital requirements to be able to handle a far more sophisticated market. And so private equity came into play, and I've been dealing with a number of those. Openness on remuneration related matters. Understand now this is in the Family Shareholders Committee. That's where you might have branches to the family and representatives of that branch. But where there's a knowledge vacuum, people fill it with their own perceptions. I'll say it again. Where there's a knowledge vacuum, people fill it with their own perceptions. And the perception that people have in terms of the remuneration is mitigated when you've got a board, you've got a REMCO in place, you've got external benchmarking, etc., for family members. So in a family business, and it's not the purpose of this presentation, you've got to deal with the gifts and the founders and that they can take their own funds and give gifts to family members. Then you've got, as owners, over time you're entitled to dividends and to share price appreciation. But by virtue of working in the business, you should have market-related remuneration. So if you start at the bottom, you don't earn a great remuneration. If you're in a key position and you're able to fulfill that position, well, your remuneration would be higher. So that's where the benchmarking and the external and the REMCOs and the subcommittees of the board. And remember, a subcommittee of the board doesn't mitigate the responsibility of the board. The board is simply delegating to that subcommittee to actually perform the work. Right, move on. All right, so let's talk about the family table. If you remember, we had the Family Shareholders Committee, we've got the individual branches, and how do we deal with the broader family context? So we want to build happy families at the end of the day. So we need to have communication and transparency amongst family members. We need to strengthen the bonds of trust and understanding, preserving the family values and traditions across generations. So that's where the family creed. Some families develop critical things with what their values as a family are. Remember, the family values from us will influence the company, but the company will have its own set of values. Quality time, building unity, relationships, understanding, getting away, having the fun weekend once a year, once every 2 years, really useful. Passing on the family's values in terms of work, education, community, integrity, respect, loyalty. Please understand that, you know, what often happens in a family business is you've got the founder of the business, and there's different temperaments and personalities between the spouse or partner of that family member, of the founder of the business. And the next generation also have different temperaments and personalities. That doesn't mean because they're not talented in a certain sphere that they're not necessarily going to be owners. They may well be owners. But how can they contribute, and how do you develop their understanding? So round pegs in square holes or square pegs in round holes, it doesn't matter. It's very difficult, but we need to develop people's understanding and sense of belonging and the integrity and respect. And as I said, communication is just key to it, articulating those values in relation to finance. So family money, patient money, and you know the extremes. I mean, a really funny case study is I happen to be the provincial leader for S&G from Thornton, and we had this person came in and met with our tax person, and they had holes in their pants, in their cars. It was completely clapped out, and I happened to walk past reception. I said to the head of tax afterwards, I said, please, you can't pull this poor guy. He said, this person's got the highest asset base of all his tax clients, so never judge a book by its cover. Right, communicating with the in-laws, I call them the outlaws, the next generation, opening the dialogue about the ideas, the intention, and what is really useful is to ask the question, what are your goals, your ambitions, your life plan, what do you want to do? And respecting that, and then see if there's an overlap. If there's no overlap, well then maybe we're not going to continue with this SME forever into perpetuity. As much as the senior generation are around to pass on a legacy, they're not able to. Right, so nurturing the legacy, affirming family members, aligning those objectives that they have as individuals, and what are their expectations, so that they can learn, so they can get an understanding and commit to the processes and the structures. You know, you're going to send them straight onto a King 4 high-level course, you know, it's going to flip them. But you go on to Being a Director Part 1. Those are really great courses that the IoD presents. So you've got to give the people the lenses to clarify what are their roles in the family, what are their roles in the business, and their roles as owners. The transitioning, the change in family circumstances, sale, acquisition, death of a family member. As I said, there's a family business that they blame COVID, but it wasn't. It was the senior generation on 90 odd. The next year is 65, they're retiring. And as for their kids, you know, it never was an option to business. Very careful of that. All right, achieving emotionally. So emotions can be a healthy transfer of the wealth. Overcome conflict. Conflict is normal. Sometimes, and often I'm called in when the missiles are flying and the lawyers are going nowhere to come in and to do a form of mediation. But to give them the lenses to look at the issues. And some of the families, well, it's taken 3 years to, one family called it, they had to excise the cancer of the past. So you overcome conflict, perform acts of service. In other words, involvement in community. As a family, we would like to do certain community things. And that creates other discussions. Well, what do we do with philanthropy? What do we do? Because I believe that we put the money into one thing, you might believe it's something else. So sometimes you need to agree to allocate families money to do that. Then I've developed this acronym, Generations. So it's governance, it's entry into the family business, it's the non-family executives, it's remuneration, it's things like the values, the trust that exists. It deals with ownership, it deals with family wealth, and it deals with succession and many other issues. So there's a whole framework, and that's in a book called Thrive, Making Family Business Work that I authored, published by Minnesota. All right, Principle 14. So, board should ensure the company remunerates fairly, responsibly, and transparently so as to promote the achievement of strategic objectives and positive outcomes in the short, medium, and long term. So do you see how this Principle 14 links into the conversation that we've just had in terms of remuneration of family, but equally, you know, if we wanted to attract and retain the best talent, how do we deal with that? And how do we deal with remunerating them fairly? And so you find in family business, there may be phantom share schemes if the family doesn't want to dispose of it. And just like with BE, special dispensations for large multinationals from an ownership point of view. So equally, we need to deal with this in terms of the governance of family and from a corporate governance point of view in relation to the business. All right, so as our society say, family, if well ordered, well instructed, and well governed, the springs from which go forth the streams of greatness, prosperity, and happiness. As I said, I don't write enlightened books where they lived happily ever after, but by adopting and getting the understanding, having the lenses, families can be successful. So I'm going to finish up before we go into the Q&A, just something very quickly in terms of the family creed. So when I develop a creed for the family, we develop what is the family's vision for the future? What do they want to do? They want to continue to own this business. In what sector do they want to own? So whether it's FMCG, whether it's agriculture, whatever it is, banking, all of those. What's their vision? What are their values and philosophy? What is the ownership philosophy? What is the management philosophy in terms of professional management? Getting wealth out of the business, the distributions, the governance structures, the board of directors, the board chairman or chairperson, the shareholders committee, the family council, the family table. How are we going to fund the family business? Remember, those in the business want to grow the business. Those typically outside the business want to get wealth outside of the business. Employment and remuneration we've touched on, and then communication, financial conflicts of interest, ethics, all of those type of things we could put in there. And this is something that typically I would develop draft, having met with the family and that, then we would discuss it, amend it, and then it needs to be reviewed every 3 to 4 years. Take that creed and give it to the next generation. Give it to the family table to work on. Let them come with their proposals and recommendation. So what happens when the pressure is on and you're saying, well, can this family member, I own this business, I might provide financial service, I want to provide it into the family business. What is the family's policy in that? And you're in the creed, and that then guides the process. All right, so from my point of view, I'm just going to read something that I wrote. It's in this book called Governance in Family Business for the IoD some time ago. That the challenge is to implement progressive family ownership and business governance structures and practices that are relevant, appropriate, and beneficial in practice manner that does not impact negatively on the entrepreneurial spirit, critical, innovation and drive of family owners are so central to the modern market-driven economy. Parallel family and business planning processes are necessary to ensure that relevant governance practices are implemented, principles-based, albeit incrementally integrating and balancing structures and processes that are pertinent to the size, nature, composition, culture, very important point, vision, goals, and strategies of the family and business. And the characteristics of good governance are discipline, responsibility, accountability, transparency, independence, fairness, and social responsibility. So thank you, and with that, over to you, Vicky, and I'm happy to take some questions.
Thank you, Tony. I think it was a very interesting session, and I can see from
What on 10 o'clock? Don't you like that, Vicky?
from the chat groups, everyone is enjoying it, and thank you for those who are attending. I see some have mentioned that they need to leave, but not to worry. The video will be on our events page, and I've asked for Sonny to just put that events page link onto the chat group as well, so that you've got the link and you can save it as a bookmark for registering for events and for all the videos as well for the past sessions. Somebody asked if they can share the video with their boards and anyone else. You're more than welcome to share the video once it's been uploaded with anyone else to take a listen to. Tony, so let's have a look at some questions. A reminder, if anyone would like to ask a question live, you can raise your hand and I will assist you on just unmuting your mic and asking your question. You can find your raise hand function on your menu. So Tony, I'm just going to have a look at some of the questions that are here. I think you have answered this one already. It was from Shadrach. But maybe just to touch on again, because you had a lovely slide, I think, that dealt with this already. His question was, for family business, what is the key difference among a board versus an advisory board and council? Are they all having fiduciary duties that is fundamental to a typical board members at the corporate level? I think you did answer that, but maybe a small summary just to conclude.
So remember, a company is a separate person, it's a separate legal persona, as they say, and one in the judge said it's a person every way, it hasn't got a body to kick and a soul to damn. So there's, in terms of the MLI, in terms of the Companies Act, there are statutory requirements, JSE requirements, and then you've got a principle-based King 4 that comes into play, and that really is the reference point in terms of governance. So we've got the Unitary Structure, which is made up of executive and non-executive directors, and they talk about a balance between those, and in relation to certain subcommittees, non-executive directors being present on that rather than the executive directors. So that would be typically your remuneration committee. The advisory board is separate, and as you say, I have dealt with it. It is more a pro forma in the sense that it's got a lot of value to add, but it wouldn't be able to take on the obligations and the responsibilities of a board of directors. That's my view and understanding of it, Vicky.
Thank you, Tony. A follow-on question to that from Nashamo, I hope I say your name correctly, is if you're working for a family business that is headquartered overseas with a central board, also sitting at that location, and you have a managing director or general manager running a local subsidiary, how do you relate this whole governance issue to this situation? And this person is talking as one of the executives.
Okay, I mean, that's a good question, because you've got different legal jurisdiction and dispensation. So we would have typically family businesses that are board with their responsibilities. And again, let's assume that this is it's controlled offshore. The shareholder is sitting offshore, but you've got a legal structure in South Africa, and even with a branch, as you know, from a tax point of view and from a legal point of view and a company point of view, there is as a company, there are legal obligations in this country, and one needs to understand that, and they need to, from an overseas perspective, also understand the obligations of an executive in a company. And so what we would find is, if you look in the motor industry, and that you would maybe have all foreign directors that are sitting on the board, but that doesn't obviate their responsibility in terms of the country that they're operating in from a governance point of view. So if there are decisions and actions taken that are prejudicial and contrary to governance in terms of the Companies Act and all the principles, then they need to be dealt with. And to the extent that they're not, a person maybe has to step down. But it's very difficult if you're an executive in the company. I can understand it. But then again, you need to look at creating onerous obligations on yourself as the non-family executive. So if you don't agree with the way it's doing and it goes against your principles and your values, well, then you need to step out of that.
Thank you, Tony. And I think also some elements of group governance might also come in, and we've got a nice King 4 group governance paper as well that you can have a look at. A question on what is the legal standing of the family creed that you mentioned. I think that was a really nice example in terms of what should go into the family creed. But what is the legal standing of that?
Okay, as I said in my presentation, this is not, and I repeat, it's not a legal document. That's why I like the term creed, because it is, it's not a constitution, because a constitution could be defined as creating legal obligations. It is a document that is developed by the family that is persuasive, and it guides them. And there's statutory aspects, yes, and you need to comply with those. But in relation to this, it's got absolutely no legal standing, but it influences the family. So, you've still got to have your ANC nuptial contracts. You still need to have all those other legal documents, shareholders agreements in place. So if you've got the trust document that relates to the trustees, or you've got a number of trusts, then between those, and they each own shares in the family business, well, then you need to put in place the normal shareholders agreements and contracts. So it hasn't got legal standing. It is persuasive, yes, I understand that, because that's what the family is sharing, their collective dream. But that's why it is so important that, they call it a creed, but they deal, because the family is an emotion system. It's emotional. It wants to deal with things, and it wants to talk about its values and applying its values, but recognizing the need for the structures. So the formal structures will be there, and it'll link the family into those formal structures and their understanding.
Thanks, Tony. I see I've got a hand raised, Becca Tamba, if you would like to ask your question. I've unmuted you.
Okay.
Yes, there we go.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. No, thank you, Vikeshni, and thanks, Tony, for the presentation. Very, very informative. So my question or maybe comment is probably maybe more of an offline discussion. If that's the case, just let me know. So I mean, I work with quite a lot of small businesses, and I think some of these insights could be potentially very, very valuable, earlier on in their journey, as opposed to maybe much later on when they're a lot bigger. And I'm just wondering what I mean, I'm a fairly new member as well of the Institute of Directors, and I'm just wondering what platforms or maybe possibilities for partnership are there that we could work together to get some of these insights, maybe through some sort of a digital platform, etc., to these groups of small businesses. So I'm very keen on exploring if that's a possibility, and how potentially we could do something along those lines, if that makes sense.
Sure. It'd be an absolute pleasure. And it is something that I'm taking each of those 10 factors that I spoke about and wanting to package it. We haven't packaged in terms of the firm, and we haven't discussed with the IoD, but we might end up joint venturing or something on that. So that's a great suggestion. And Vicky knows Jürgen, we'll pick up from our firm point of view and look at it and communicate about those. But I certainly have, I did a webinar about 10 days ago not focusing on the governance aspect, but on the other aspects of family business. And I did say that we would be doing that, but it's not in place yet, Vicky. So you can communicate from the IoD side.
You're welcome to send me an email, and we can definitely take it forward in terms of that. I think we've got, and obviously you will have the recording of this video as well as a nice introduction as well to share.
Sure.
To many small businesses, and then we can always add on to the conversation from here. Elizabeth, you also had your hand up, so I'm going to unmute you and allow you to also ask your question. Is that working on your side? Mute. Elizabeth, can you possibly, I don't know if you have an unmute button on your side, but I've unmuted you on my side. Okay, maybe while we try figure that one out, Tony, in the meantime, just having a look at the questions here. Some questions around, have there been any studies looking at whether it's better for small business growth to stay family owned or whether to branch out into external ownership? Do you have any thoughts on that, Tony?
As I said, the principles are the same, but you've got to find your own unique solution. There are huge studies done. It's a huge field, family business. There's something called the FFI, the Family Firm Institute, of which I'm a fellow, but immersed myself, as I said, in the last 25 years in the US, and going through probably a decade of training and courses and that. So you find that there's a number of professions of origin. What you find is there's the psychology perspective of looking at it. There's the management, there's the financial and that. And so you've got to synthesize those professions of origin into one when you're working with, and you've got to work very responsibly with family businesses. And the bottom line is there is research. There's a lot of research. IFERA, International Family Enterprise Research Academy. But I can tell you now, there is no one solution to it, and there's no one preferred method. And again, it depends on the issues I've spoken about, the industry that you're in, the family commitment to making it forward, what it's going to take. And, we haven't even got into the 6 capitals and talking about the family capital. And the family capital is, are they able to operate responsibly in terms of ownership? So it's their ability, sure, it is the intellect that they've got, sure, it's the financial capital, but it's the emotional capital. It's what do they own? The brands. So you'll see many family businesses, the big international luminaries, very, very strong brands that they sit on. There's some that are suited to continuity beyond the current generation. But if you're in a family business providing a unique service or a specialized service, and let's say you're a great plumber, and you say, well, I want to take this forward. Well, then you're going to have to look at saying, well, how do we franchise this? How do we take it forward? And we've seen franchise and just franchisors and franchisees. So again, are we able to get the critical mass that exists? So there's no easy answer to the question. There's no one-off thing.
Paku, I've unmuted your mic if you'd like to ask your question. My mics don't seem to be working this morning. There we go, Paku. There we go.
Okay. Thank you, Tony, for insightful presentation. I want to know something in relation to, trusts. When you register them, there is a clause that says in the event of ending their lives, you have to take all the asset to another trust of similar objectives. Is there anything that can be done? Sometimes maybe I've registered my house for the future of my children under trust. Can I say, right, that the house will remain? I'll give others and I'll remain with the house.
Okay. I hear your question. You know, a trust is really, it's got rights and obligations, and it's in the trust document. A trust can continue in perpetuity, but that can equally be very, very, very dangerous in terms of, you know, do you continue? Do you put this onerous obligation on, in your example, the one house or the business that has to continue? And so what you find is a trust document that is drafted within certain parameters. There certainly is no termination or that it has to be disposed of, but be very careful. Some people use them as generational skipping devices, but be very careful of creating, and who are the trustees, who are the beneficiaries. There's so many considerations. And so that circle I was talking about, the family circle, what does the family want? And what does the incumbent generation want? And then articulating that, putting in a trust document. As you know, with trust, you can have letters of wishes in terms of influencing the trustees. You know, you need to have independent trustees, family members can be trustees. There's trust companies that can be onshore, that can be offshore. It's a very complex field, and I'm happy to go offline on a discussion of your particular set of circumstances.
Thanks, Tony. Vinod, you already unmute. You can ask your question.
Yeah, good morning, Tony, and good morning, Vikesh. And thank you very much for the informative session. Tony, what would be your advice in trying to resolve a dysfunctional board? What would be the best solution to try and get the board more functional? But at the moment, it's very dysfunctional.
Okay, can I ask, is it a board effectively where a family's got control?
Not total control, but
it is the entity. Sorry, I should phrase that better. The entity itself, the operating company, is the equity held by a family.
Yes, correct.
And you've got executive directors and you've got non-executive directors.
Yes,
and
correct.
But independent non-executive directors, in other words, not family that's on that board.
Correct.
All right. Where I would start is I would actually start with the family, and I would actually have a session with them explaining the family issues, family dynamics, looking at what are, as individuals, what are the goals, ambitions, life plan, what do the family collectively want, and because they're the controlling shareholders, they effectively appoint the board of directors and have a look at what is the skill set that we require, and then move forward in trying to address that problem where the board is conflicted, because there must be vested interests. You know, they're not through independent fiduciary role and stewardship responsibilities of board members. So it's very complex. And we can go through that, but those are some of the pointers that I would look at. You know, you can't just bore in and say, right, we're going to sit with the board, we're going to have a mediation session just with the board. We've got to get back and work from the family perspective. Also, we'd look at the business as well. We'd look at the individuals on the board. What do we want to achieve? Get the family creed in place, and then we can start developing charters and all those good things to address what the board wants to achieve. So I'm happy also to go offline on that one.
But it will have to be, it will be more than likely be independent, so that it will have a better impact.
Ideally, you want to have independent non-executive directors, because you can have a family member that's not executive, but they're not necessarily independent. And when you talk to the families and different branches may like different individuals, so you've got to get consensus on who we would like to have on our board, and who is on our board that is problematic, and what do we actually want to achieve from an ownership point of view, and check from a corporate governance point of view that the family is not in conflict with some fundamental business principles that are sound. So it's very complicated. It's not just some, but if you've got the family sorted out, then you can deal with the from an ownership point of view, controlling owner, then you can look at the other issues.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks, Vinod. You're welcome to maybe get in touch with Tony, and you can explore that, I guess, in more detail. Tony, so there's a question from Deepak. Hi, Tony. Good to hear your expertise once again. In relation to family businesses, a different trend I've seen develop is that an outsider is brought in as MD and offered a minority shareholding. This is because the skill does not exist in a family member, or no family member wants to take up the position. So how does one deal with the conflict situation where the MD is presenting his strategic vision that the board may not be aligned to? Is this role of external MD a poisonous chalice in these scenarios? Is Deepak's question.
Okay, so we've got an MD, so let's assume this person is effectively the Chief Executive Officer. They're on a board, and they have to look at the board. Have we got an independent chairman or chairperson on that board? What is the board actually comprised of? Where the person's got equity, they need to align with the long-term orientation of the shareholder, because understand, if you're a managing director and you own shares in the business, you're there for a 5-year period. You're going to have a short-term. 5 years is long-term in the industries on that. But the point, you hear my point. My point is that you've got to align with the long-term orientation of the family. So, that's why that family creed is so important, because we take that creed and we actually give it to these key executives in the business so they can see, and they need to say they're aligned to what the family wants to achieve. The other thing is make sure you've got a buy and sell agreement. So if they've actually got not just phantom shares, but real shares in the business, that, you've got a shareholders agreement and how you will exit that person if need be.
Thanks, Tony. Here's a good question in terms of a business starting off. What would be your advice for family business in its start stage, where the financial position of the SME cannot afford a board of directors? What should the family business start with? Obviously, the intention of attaining a shared, there's an intention of attaining a shared structure, but what is the most important thing to kind of start with in this scenario?
That's a good question, because that's where most businesses find themselves in terms of, as I used the example, when you start out, your survival mode that you're in that entrepreneurial phase. Once you get to the mature phase, well, by then you've actually having to maybe have an audit. Again, depends on your size. So you've got your trusted advisor has been your auditor up until now, or the banker or the private equity fund or whatever. And so you've got people giving advice from different perspectives. As to the board members, again, it depends. If you formed a CC, well, then a close corporation, then you're an owner and you're a director, okay? Or if you're a PDY Limited, as exists today, although you still find close corporations, you would have a separation between the ownership and the board. And typically, the founder of the business, the originator, would be appointed as the director, and he would rely on his accountants and all the rest of it. And so, what I would suggest, you try and surround yourself with people. And what happens is, some look at family business individuals that are in similar market sectors, even competitors, and others, and people that are esteemed in the community to come on board, maybe in an advisory, not straight into a director, because they might, if they understand the obligations, they might not want to take that on. So bring them in an advisory. So people in business that are successful in business. Some family businesses, what I've seen they've done is they've actually got the CEO of a listed company to come on as a non-executive independent director onto their board. So where those people are, exactly who they are, and that you need to find those people, but they effectively play an advisory role. Okay.
Journey, sorry, my dogs.
You can't pick them up off the shelf at some company or the IoD, as you know.
A question from Edmore. There's always a balancing act between employing and promoting a family member versus an external employee. How best can one strike a balance between being fair to your own family members in terms of giving them a chance and retaining or attracting competent staff? That's a bit of a difficult one.
No, it's not. Treat family as family and business as business. So if somebody is coming in and you're saying we want to grow family, and you're going to want to encourage family members to come in, then be very careful of how you deal with that. Because if you've got a position, and let's say we've got a non-family member in that position, and we want to bring a family member in, well, then we've got to be dynamic. So some families, for example, will have a CEO or an MD that is a family member, but they would also bring somebody alongside in that position. Now, nepotism, the glass ceiling, I think that's what's been referred to. So if you're wanting to attract and retain people, they should be able to go right through, and they should know what level to. So the mayor, you might be my family members this year, or they bring a technical expertise. The head of production is an outsider. Then you've got to have a look at innovative mechanisms for remunerating. So if it's benchmarked externally, you've got a family member that has come in, then there needs to be a progression and an openness and transparency in how you remunerate them. Versus a non-family member that you want to attract that's market related, you want to keep that person that might be in IT or whatever it is. You've got to play a balancing act, but at the end of the day, you've got to give people a sense that if I'm an IT specialist, I'm vying for the position of being chief information officer, but there's a glass ceiling for that because we're always going to have a family member there, then it needs to be clear to that person. And maybe that glass ceiling for the CIO needs to be removed. But you treat the family business as a business and operate as a meritocracy. To bring family members in is great to give them opportunities, but it shouldn't be at the cost of the company and what's in the best interest of the company. And so I often have family businesses where people come in, and some have got a rule, well, not until you've achieved a certain level of qualification, got outside experience. Some bring them in straight after school. Well, that's a very different way that you've got to treat those two situations with family members. And then you've got to, if you've got a family creed that defines that it'll be market related and that, then people understand that. If you've got to toss a coin between a family member of equal ability and prominence and non-family member, well, then you need to broach it with that non-family member to say, right, you've reached your zenith and your ceiling here. But if you are promoting not on a basis of merit, it's going to be to the detriment of your company. You know, don't try and put a CFO in if they've got no experience and expertise in management, accounting, finance, and all the rest of it, just to give them a title. You know, hide into nothing. Business is business and family is family.
Thanks, Tony. Another question. I think we're almost up for time. And let's see if we can do one more. There's a question here which is a bit different from the others. Etienne wanted to know, in an owner-managed business and a family business, there's loan accounts, often historically provided working capital. Also, the loan accounts could be an asset in the company's hands as withdrawals was made on loan account instead of remuneration or dividends. How do you approach clearing out these debt and credit loans account as part of succession?
That's a good question. You know, what you find is a family member that is, say, 50 years of age, and another family member, same parents, everything, is 35 years of age. You can have disparities in the loan account. And some family members, you have instances where the 50-year-old has overdrawn and they're in a debit, so they owe the company money. And the 35-year-old, you said, well, you put in the sweat equity and you build up your loan account, then you can start taking money out the loan account. So loan accounts, debit loan accounts are problematic, period. I don't believe the company should be allowing family members to go into debit loan accounts. Let's just picture the situation. We made a big profit, we're paying a special dividend, we haven't got the cash, we distribute for whatever reason against a loan account. So that's a credit loan account in the company now. We're in my CA app, so I don't know if it's helpful what I'm talking about. But what happens is you've got a credit loan account, and so the company owes you money. Now, let's say we've got that situation. Then we've got to say, well, how do we, if this family member is retiring from the business, and let's say it's a second and we're into a third generation, then we've got to structure a plan to be able to repay that loan account. So it might be that we don't pay dividends and the company uses that cash to repay the loan account. So there's a lot of facets and aspects to that, Vicky. Yeah.
Thank you, Tony. And I think with that, it brings us to a close to this morning's session. Thank you for all those who have stayed on, and thank you, Tony, for giving us your time, and I think sharing your wealth of knowledge and providing a nice landscape to kind of look at as a starting point in what everyone should consider from a family-run business. I'm sure there's a lot more conversations that need to be had, and there's a lot of elements that you touched on that need to, we need to delve in much deeper. So we'll see if we can maybe do some more sessions to, zone in on some of those topics that you raised. But thank you very much for your time. Your details are on the screen as well. So anyone who would like to get in touch with you can get in touch with you via these avenues. And as I said, the video will be available hopefully by the end of the week on our website. You can go back, have a look at some of the questions that were raised, go back and hear some of the things, and especially I think the items around the creed. You can go back and look at that and share it with your peers and other individuals that are in these situations. So thank you very much again, Tony, and I look forward to seeing everyone again next week, same time. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Vicky. Bye-bye.